Hey guys, Constance here. Welcome back to the kitchen here to Good Life Farm. So Mr. Smith has been asking me to make something for him, and so that is what I'm going to do today. As you can see, I've got my apron on, I've got my Bosch mixer out. We're going to do a little bit of baking. I felt like today was the perfect day to do this because it's about 1.5 degrees outside. The weatherman has said it's going to be the hottest day of the year. It is miserable outside. So doing a little bit of baking is the perfect way to enjoy some air conditioning. So what I am going to make today are some dinner rolls. Now, they're dinner rolls that of course you could eat with dinner, but they are great to kind of snack on as well if you like to snack on breads. I don't know anybody who doesn't like to snack on breads from time to time, but this recipe is just made with classic white bread flour. I do a lot of baking where I mill my own wheat for it, but this is a great recipe for someone who maybe doesn't do that or maybe doesn't do a lot of baking and just wants to pick up a bag of bread flour and make some homemade dinner rolls. I'm going to take you through the process. This recipe in particular, I'm actually going to be doubling it to make a big batch. And I'm actually going to have a little bit of extra bread dough left over from this batch to just make a loaf of bread to go along with it. So the measurements I will be doing are going to be double what my normal recipe quantities would be. So if you head on over to my website to print out the text version of this recipe, the quantities will be half of what I'm using today. Alright, so to get started, I've got my big ol' bucket here of bread flour, and I'm going to need 6 cups of bread flour to begin with. Now I may end up needing a little bit more. We'll see what happens as this starts mixing up, and I'll add more if needed. So 6 cups of just your classic unbleached bread flour. And I'm going to not talk while I'm doing this so I don't lose count. Alright, 6 cups of bread flour. So to this I'm going to add 4½ teaspoons of yeast, and I'm using instant yeast, but you can really use rapid rise or regular yeast. It works just fine. It just might take a little bit longer for the dough to rise. I'm going to add in 1 tablespoon of sea salt. I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. I'm adding in 1/2 cup of honey. Alright, now I need 2 eggs. And then the last thing to go in is 2 cups plus 2 tablespoons of warm water. Now, of course, you could do this by hand if you wanted to. You would just combine the ingredients in a mixing bowl, kind of bring it together into a dough, and then knead it by hand. But I use my mixer because it just makes my life easy. Put on my lid here. And so I've got my dough hook in here, and I'm going to turn on my mixer and let it run for 10 minutes. Now, I'm going to keep an eye on the dough in the process, and if it's still looking a little bit sticky, I'll add in a little bit of extra flour, about a tablespoon or so at a time, until it gets to where it ought to be. Just a nice, soft dough. Alright, so my bread dough is done mixing, and so now I'm just going to let it sit here in the bowl for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, basically until the dough itself has risen to double its size. And so how long that takes is just going to depend upon how warm your kitchen is. So I will wash up my dishes from mixing up the dough and let this sit and join back with you in a little bit. Alright, you guys, so my bread dough has been rising here. Let me open this up here and give you a look at it. See, it's nice and risen here. So now I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour here on the counter, grab my dough knife and my pans, and we'll start forming the rolls. So I'm just kind of coating this with some flour a little bit so that it's not sticky, make it manageable to work with. So now I'm just going to take my dough knife here, kind of divide this in half, make it a little bit more manageable. Now I've got a baking sheet right here. This is a nice heavy stainless steel one. You could also use a baking stone, whatever you like. I've got it lined with some parchment paper. So I'm going to take my bread dough here, and I'm just going to kind of spread it out a little bit. And I'm going to start cutting it into pieces. And you just want to get them about the same size, and a little bit of flour here so we're not getting sticky. Alright, so I'm going to grab a piece of dough here with some floured fingers, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of roll it over on itself. Just kind of rolling it over, tucking it in like this. Like that. And then I'm just going to kind of pinch all of the edges together so that we've got a nice smooth surface on top. Pinched all the edges together on the bottom. And I'm going to take it and set it on my baking pan. And I'm going to do this with every piece of dough Spread it out, start folding in the edges, pinch them all together, and then pinch side down. And you do want to try and get them about the same size. If they're not exactly the same size, that's okay, but do try and get them at least somewhat close in size. And these are, each one of these little balls here is, I would say, about the size of a plum. And I'm just going to set them all here on the pan and leave a little bit of space in between all of them. And I'm going to do that with all of this dough. So I've got my pan filled with rolls here, and I've got a good bit of dough left over because, like I said, I've doubled this recipe. So I will just roll this up, shape it into a loaf, drop it into a greased and floured loaf pan, and then I will cover it with a tea towel along with my rolls here and let them rise for, again, 30 minutes to an hour or so until they're doubled in size, and then we will bake them. Alright, you guys, so my rolls here are done rising, and my bread is done rising, and so now I've got my little pastry brush here, and I have a dish of milk, and I'm just going to very gently take my brush and brush the tops of all of the rolls with a little bit of milk. And so while my dough was finishing rising, and I've been doing this, my oven has been heating up to 350 degrees. And so now I've got all of these brushed with milk, and so I will stick my pans in the oven, and I will bake these for about 18 minutes. Alright, you guys, as you can see, I've got my rolls here, I've got my bread down here sitting on a rack, and I'll let the bread sit there in the pan for just a couple of minutes, and then I'll go ahead and remove it from the pan. Let me show you this loaf of bread here. Look at that beauty. So I'll let that sit there in the pan for just a few minutes, and then I'll remove it from the pan and let it cool on the rack. And my rolls here Because they're on parchment paper, I'll be able to slide those right off of the pan here in just a moment. But that is it. This is how you make these fantastic dinner rolls. As I said, Mr. Smith calls them the best dinner rolls he has ever had, made by anybody. And so you can make a really big batch of these, and they freeze very well. You would just let them cool completely. So I hope you enjoyed coming along in the kitchen with me and baking these. Again, there is a printable version of this recipe on my website, and I will put a link to that down below. And this bread dough, I use it for making all sorts of things. I have used it for making cinnamon rolls, hamburger rolls. Basically, I just roll it out and use a biscuit cutter, just like I'm making biscuits, except it's the bread dough instead of biscuit dough. And it's a very universal bread dough. So that's it for today. Thanks for hanging out with me here in the kitchen. I'll talk to y'all next time.